Hey, what's up, family? This is Edwin McCain and Kelly Bell, and welcome to our conversation. And we have a very special guest this week. So I'm going to throw it to Edwin and let him kind of introduce him.
So welcome to our continuing conversation. I'm honored to have one of my dearest friends. I would call him a mentor, and we've known each other for close to 30 years now. And I'll let Charles tell you the story, but I posted a speech a week or so ago that his father gave in 1963 after the bombings in Alabama. And I wanted you to have some context of that, but welcome to our show, Charles. Thank you for being here. Boy, we need your father's words are ringing truer today. Even now.
And Charles, maybe you could start with maybe giving us some background in that speech, because we did post it. I posted it too. It's a very, very powerful piece.
All right. Well, thanks, Edwin. It's always a joy to see you. I don't see you often enough. And I'm always interested in talking about my dad because I'm very proud of him. What Edwin referenced was the church bombing in Birmingham in September of 1963 at the 16th Street Baptist Church. And the morning after that bombing, my father gave a speech. He was a 33-year-old attorney. And he gave a speech that was covered by newspapers around the country and around the world, but wasn't covered in Birmingham. And after about 2 weeks, Look magazine did a profile on my dad and the speech. And at that point, they couldn't ignore it anymore, and we started getting threats. So we lasted about 2 weeks in Birmingham before we were run out of town. So it was a dramatic speech, particularly for a 33-year-old, not struggling attorney, but my dad was just a lawyer. His parents had grown up in the hills of eastern Kentucky, a place called Big Sandy Creek, in the poorest of poor counties in Kentucky, coal mining area. His daddy had gotten out. They lived in Fort Thomas, Kentucky for a little bit and moved to Birmingham when my dad was a teenager. He ended up going to the University of Alabama and Alabama Law School, but he did not come from any kind of liberal background. But he did come from a background where fairness was important. And so the events shaped my dad more than my dad shaped any kind of events in those days. And that speech changed his life forever.
And he went on to be Dr. King's attorney and Muhammad Ali's attorney. And he, famously was part of a lot of landmark civil rights cases. You guys moved to Atlanta after that, right?
Yeah, he was. He went to Atlanta. We went to Atlanta just after the church bombing, and my dad, he started the Southern office of the American Civil Liberties Union. There had never been one, and their office was at 5 Forsyth Street, and that office building also housed the SCLC, Dr. King's group. It had the Voter Education Project, John Lewis's group. It had the Great Speckled Bird, which was the alternative paper in Atlanta. And it was my dad's office looked across the street into Ralph McGill. He was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution and a wonderfully moderate man in those days. And so my dad, he tried 9 cases before the Supreme Court. And
wow.
Anything that came up in the South, he was a gunslinger. And that's how he got started in Birmingham. There was no one that would take cases that bordered on issues of civil rights. And my father took them. He'd represent anybody, and that's where he started, and that's where he ended. And so Dr. King, he represented Dr. King, Julian Baum, when Julian was elected to the state legislature and they would not seat him because he'd come out against the Vietnam War. He took that case. He represented Ali in his draft deferment case in Houston. And, I met all those guys. I was a kid, but Atlanta was a small place. And it was different then, and Dr. King and Muhammad Ali were not then what they became later and in death. They were, Ali was, he was Cassius Clay, and he was an outspoken, loudmouth draft dodger to many, many Americans.
That nobody could hit with a punch.
No, nobody did that. And Dr. King, when he came back from winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, he was the youngest Nobel Peace Prize recipient at that time. And Ivan Allen was the mayor, and they were going to have a celebration for a lifelong. Dr. King was born in Atlanta, and they had it at the Dinkler Hotel, and they couldn't get anyone to come. They invited everybody in town, and no one would come. And Ivan Allen got with the folks at Coca-Cola, and Paul Austin, who had just come back from the Coca-Cola operations in Johannesburg after 12 years. They went to the Piedmont Driving Club, and they sat down, and Coca-Cola made it very clear that Coca-Cola was an international company, and that Atlanta needed Coca-Cola more than Coca-Cola needed Atlanta. They could go anywhere. And
wow.
That filled up 1,500. It was a hotel ballroom. It took Coca-Cola to step in with their strong footprint to honor Dr. King the way he should have been honored in his hometown. So
that's an awesome story.
And Dr. King was, everybody knew who he was, but he was not the figure that he's not the icon that we all recognize today. He was just a guy, more than a guy, but he was just a regular man.
Speaking of that, Charles, let me ask one question. So that Edwin told me the story about when you were a kid and your dad was working with Dr. King, and you being an adolescent were kind of shy about giving your dad a hug. And can you tell that story real quick before we move on into today's issues?
Yeah, again, this is a long time ago, but the Atlanta airport, when we were growing up, it's not much different than the airport where I live now. It's just a small, Hartsville is a very small airport. And my father, my mom, my dad had a tendency to drink a little too much. And so we were used to driving my dad around, picking him up at the office. We went to the airport to pick my dad up. He was coming back from out of town, and I was 13 years old. It was in 1967, and I went inside the terminal. There was just one long terminal, and my dad was coming down the corridor with Dr. King, Andy Young, Ralph Abernathy, and Jose.
Oh, my God. So the entire civil rights movement.
Yeah, they'd come back from somewhere, and they took their lawyer with them. And my dad came up to me, and I guess as a 13-year-old kid, he came to give me a hug, and I must have shrugged it off. I'm sure I did. And I felt a tap on my shoulder, and it was Dr. King, and he said, Charles, he said, don't ever be afraid to show affection for another man, particularly when it's your father.
Wow.
And that was a lesson I learned at a young age. I don't think I went the rest of my life without giving my dad a kiss every time I saw him. I do that with my kids today.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that story with us, man. It's great.
So Charles, what have you guys been? I know you've been for our folks out there. Charles is a very successful restaurateur. He has Harbor Docks in Destin, Chuck's Fish in Birmingham and Tuscaloosa, and Five, and also El Papi Tacos in Mobile, Alabama. There's a lot. You've been very, very successful in the restaurant business. Now, when this pandemic hit, what has your response been to the situation?
We took it very, very seriously from the very beginning, but we also, one of our general things is we just put one foot in front of the other and take deep breaths. We did that, and we did curbside service at all of our stores from the beginning. We kept all of our salaried staff on the staff, and we furloughed as few people as possible, and we found a way to take care of those people while they waited, some forever, and still have not received unemployment. We found a way to keep them, like Harbor Docks, which is across the street from where I am now. When we reopened at 25% occupancy, every single employee that we had came back, except for Sunshine McCollister, who had a heart attack, but thank goodness she's back now. So places that lost their folks, I don't know how they would do it differently. I'm very proud of all of our places and how we handled it. And also, throughout this, we fed people through American Lunch, which is our 501c3. And we have in every town, Athens, Birmingham, Tuscaloosa, Mobile, and Pensacola, and here in Destin, we feed people. That's what we've done for 40 years, and we've been fortunate enough to make a profit at it. And so giving away a little food's not that big a deal. And we give food to everybody, no questions asked, and did it. We did over 30,000 meals in the month of April and in all of those towns. So we stayed really, really busy. We were busier than we normally are during that. And now with the limited openings, we've done that. All of our employees wear masks. We do table spacing. So we're working at 50% occupancy in most places now, but we're going to be okay.
Right.
Well, Charles, I'm sorry, Edwin.
No, I guess what I'm getting to is that you and I have always agreed that when things get difficult, it's time to get to work. Like it's almost an opportunity to work harder and not necessarily for yourself, but that's when your role in a community really is needed, right? It's easy to be effective in a community when everything's going right, but what are you going to do when it goes wrong? And that's why I've always admired that about you, and that's what Kelly and I are trying to do here, because this is the moment where everybody's going to have to step up and make change. Try to continue to make change. Let's keep the ball moving, and being a progressive thinker in the places that we live. It's not always easy to. I'm tiptoeing around it, but it's not always easy to be out here trying to do good things for the right reasons without catching a little bit of pushback and question. People question the motive, but I don't think you have to have one other than doing the right thing. And you've always taught me that.
Well, in our industry in particular, I think you'll find that independent restaurants, local restaurants, that they're generally the ones, anybody will sponsor a little league team. We like to do a little bit more than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Charles, Edwin's tiptoeing around it. I'm coming hard.
All right.
So strap up. Here we go. Candace Owens. Ready, set, go.
I knew about it, and Edwin sent it to me earlier, and I saw it. And I think for the most part, it's an issue of semantics, and the whole screed was basically about martyrs. Well, I don't know anybody that's arguing that George Floyd is a martyr. He has some different things. That is not one of them. Martyrs are Dr. King, Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy, people that were killed for their political or religious views. Trayvon Martin, as horrific as that was, Trayvon Martin's not a martyr either. These are men that were murdered by cops, and Trayvon Martin by a security guard. But that's something to make. I just came from Athens, Georgia yesterday, and I can tell you the people that I saw that were in the streets in nothing but peaceful protests. It was amazing to me, and incredible. It was a huge majority, 80 or 90% of the people in Athens, there were 3,000 people in the streets Saturday night, were white people. And of that group, and we have people that we work with in those towns, we have 2 restaurants in Athens, you cannot believe how many young, white, suburban sorority girls who have never protested anything in their life were in that crowd. They were pissed off, and they've had enough. And unlike people in my generation many of my generation didn't go to integrated schools. These kids have. they've grown up with black kids. They've grown up with gay kids. And it was the most, I was more excited about seeing that than anything else. George Floyd, he's like most of us, a little good, a little bad. That has absolutely nothing
to do with
what
it.
happened there.
Right.
And, so that lady, whoever she was, she's sharper than hell and mean. I wish she was on my team.
Well, for the right price, she might
Yeah.
be.
Well, and so anyway, so to that, what we're trying to do is honestly, I'm listening to everything that people bring to me, as long as it's not hateful, right? I want to hear. I vigorously defend people's rights to think and say the things they feel like they need to. What we're hoping to do is create common ground, and you've done a really amazing job in Destin over the years of offering an alternative opinion in the paper, in op-eds, and just by being consistent, right? I don't know you to be any different all these years, right? And I feel like that's the challenge now. So the good people that have been consistent all these years have to keep following the path they've been on, and be available to talk about this stuff. And I've got a lot of people circling the campfire like, okay, well, maybe we can hear this. But what do you say to encourage the moderates that are on the fence that want to say, well, this is my problem. I haven't been doing anything. I'm not racist. I don't, what would you say?
Well, first of all, I think it's a question of fairness. And I think people need to learn, first of all, not to be mean. And they need to learn to be fair. And Edwin, I live like you in the South my whole life. And where I live now, this is the most conservative county in the state of Florida. And I'm a Democrat. And my family's been there. And I tell the story, about my granddaddy when he took my dad to vote, and they were in the old-timey vote booth where you pull the curtain behind you. And he said, son, one of the most important things in America, your vote is private. Nobody knows who you voted for. When you close this curtain, there's nobody in here but you and God. And he said, God's a Democrat. That made it, you talk about, we always look for simpler ways to live life. That made my life much simpler. So we host all the Democratic candidates, national and state, at our restaurant. We're the only ones brave enough to do it, and it's hurt our business. But we still do it, and we'll always do it. And I think we get away with it because people know we're fair people.
You're fair people. And that community would be vastly different without you.
And it's funny how you can show that different experiences because, so Charles, I grew up hearing stories at my dinner table, and in the black communities, our stories tend to be a little different. And so you had a very positive story that you were talking, that from your pops and your grandpop. I have a story from my father, who was a United States Navy vet during Korea. He was part of some of the first troops that were also desegregated. And when he tried to vote one time, and he had to take an intelligence test to say that he was smart enough to be able to actually cast a vote for the president of the United States. And the first question on the test was, how high is up? And obviously that's not a question that you're ever going to answer correctly. So he was denied his opportunity to vote that particular day. This is a man that was there on the March on Washington, stood next to me at the Million Man March. I mean, this was a very, very passionate, proud American vet who was not allowed to vote for the president of the United States because he didn't know how high up was.
And things have changed, but some.
Or have they?
Yeah, good question. But my dad, I tell people when they're trying to show that there has been some change. In 1965, he tried a case, and they said he was a master at naming cases, and it was called White versus Crook, and it was in Wilcox County in Alabama. And that case, and the reason they filed it, that went to the Supreme Court, and it forced Alabama to put women on juries. So in the movement with John Lewis, the Voter Education Project, to try to get blacks to vote, they figured it might be pretty good to, first of all, get women on the juries anyway. So that was only 55 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
And, women and blacks didn't vote in Alabama either, or serve on juries. So those were the kinds of things that the Supreme Court under Earl Warren, now you want to call it an activist court, call it what you want to, they were active in trying to make this the country that our Constitution tells us it is.
Right. And that's back to what I've said to people. I've sent your father's speech to people and prefaced it with, if he was brave enough to stand up in that moment as a 33-year-old lawyer and say that, then you can be brave enough to listen to it.
And I don't think people really recognize, Edwin, what you're saying, because you're literally talking about brave enough to stand up and say that when those around him were being assassinated for the same words.
Well, if you look, what my dad said was really similar, not nearly as well written, but it's a letter from a Birmingham jail, which is Dr. King, and it's studied in schools. It is one of the most remarkable letters ever, and it was written to the clergy in Birmingham, and that's who my dad taught.
I read it every year on his birthday.
It's unbelievable. Everyone needs to read that. But that was the question. When people are being silent, that's not doing any good for anyone.
And that was a really bold presentation, but for Dr. King to call out his own clergy, all religions get on board, and he's saying it from a jail cell. That's a big deal.
And if we're looking for hope, which I always am, think about young white sorority girls at a Southern university protesting this George Floyd death. And that gives me optimism that people that have been quiet for a long time are not going to be quiet anymore.
Yeah. I want to dive in on some of those questions, Kelly, because I'd like to.
Speaking of what you were just talking about, so Mandy wrote into us, Mandy W. wrote into us, and she said, okay, here's her big concern. She says, I'm an elementary school educator. I work in a very diversely populated school, though it is still predominantly white. How do I, as a white woman, walk into that building and help children understand that they can trust me after all of this? How can I shape their minds and the minds of the other students who are being raised in households where any race but white is unacceptable? How do we begin to bridge the gap at the level that we can stop the bleeding as they get older? So that's a lot of question.
I would say, to be fair, and it's something that is probably beyond her ability, but kids need to study the civil rights movement. Young African Americans today, they need to know who John Lewis is, and need to know what he did on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, and they need to watch a 23-year-old kid in a raincoat and a knapsack who had been to the Highland School in Monteagle, just like Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks is a little bit more than just a lady whose feet was started. She'd studied nonviolence to the point where they studied how to curl up, how to protect themselves when they were being hit. And Dr. King always knew the power of Gandhi's nonviolent approach. And if anybody had thrown a rock, or if anything had happened, that would have greatly detracted from his movement. But when the images of John Lewis being beat went around the world, that's what led to blacks being able to vote and integration and lots of other things. The power, nonviolence is amazingly powerful when done right, but very few people can relate to that today. And I can understand that too, but they need to know about it. And in so many schools now where we are, Kelly, civil rights movement is a couple of paragraphs in a history book.
Right.
I would also suggest that there are a lot of white people that are making assumptions about how they're being viewed by black people in this moment, right? I think she might feel that she's being judged in this moment for just simply being white. First of all, I would say that don't lose that feeling for a second, because that's probably the first time you've had to think about being white, right? And secondly, you know, if you've been a good person and a good teacher to these children, that's how they see you. Like they're not thinking in the terms that we like to overlay this lens on everything, and I don't think children see it that way. I think they see you based on their experience with you, not what you look like. You know,
I agree with you as being the optimal thing, but
sure.
But we also are, you know, we're talking nature and nurture here. So if it was completely left up to nature, then Edwin, I'll be behind you 100%. And Charles, just in case you didn't know, this gets to be a little point counterpoint sometimes, because Edwin and I don't always agree on things, but we do meet in the middle with love. So I think you have to think about nurture too, where the way people are raised right from the very beginning, because it can really help to develop your personality and who you are and how you think and how you behave, how you speak with people, all of that stuff. And it's hard. It's impossible to say that that's not a factor, even for a teacher walking into the classroom. You know, she wants to know what she can do as a white woman walking into a predominantly white school and be able to support black kids who remain the minority in that position. How do they feel safe? I don't think you do that by not acknowledging the elephant in the room. They don't. Sure. They don't just see her as being their teacher. She's still a white teacher.
Okay.
She's not just a teacher, and I don't think it's realistic for her to walk away thinking that, oh, I'm just their teacher and they just love me as their teacher. No, she's still the white teacher.
That's not what I'm getting at. I think really, you know, being consistent in who she is, but being honest about the truth. I guess that's what I'm trying to get to.
But doesn't that come back to what Charles was saying about basically you got to know where you've been and know where you're going? So he's saying you have
to be honest about it. You have to teach it. I mean, you have to talk about the history of this. This is how we move it down. It's just not acknowledging it, pretending like it's over. That's not the truth.
And I'm not a tremendously optimistic person. I try to be a realist as much as possible, but I can tell you that in the routes that I cover in the South, Selma, Alabama, Montgomery, Atlanta, Birmingham, Memphis, Julian Bond for years took a group from Charlottesville, Virginia on civil rights tours. John Lewis speaks at all of them. My mom speaks at the one in Birmingham. And if you go to Selma, Alabama now, which is not doing great, but you'll see, you can't drive through there without seeing people on the sidewalks, people walking over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And it took me a while to figure out they're tourists. They're civil rights tourists. What Brian Stevenson's done in Montgomery is unbelievable. And it has created an enormous amount of tourism in Montgomery, people coming to see what happened. I went to an event with Julian in Birmingham, and there were professors from Australia and New Zealand, history professors, that were there. It was remarkable to them that this was history where they could still see people. Julian's passed on, but they can still see John Lewis, and they can still see the places these things happened fairly recently. So there's that, and I have a feeling that this younger generation, and I don't even know what the name of this youngest generation is, they're going to be different. I'm telling you, they look at this in a different way. And
can I ask something of you two guys, both being Southerners? How do you feel about these Confederate statues and things? Because this is a question that actually came up from last week, and there was at least 3 or 4 people that kind of chimed in about some of the Confederate statues and awards and all the other memorabilia that the government has paid for many, many moons now. Not just the development of it, but the maintenance of it. Now that they're starting, a lot of states have started to roll back and kind of eliminate that stuff, seeing it as a dark part of our history. What's your viewpoint on that as just Southern men?
Edwin?
Well, I defer to General Lee. He was asked about this, and you can look this quote up on Snopes. But you know, the basic gist of what he said is that I think we need to leave this in the past and not have the potential for ill will carried on by having monuments. And General Lee himself didn't think it was a good idea to have these monuments. And really, for me, like, that's really all I need to know. Not to mention, you know, that sort of settles the argument for me. Plus, you know, I worked for Senator McConnell as a Senate page when I was a freshman in college. I didn't know who he was, and I got chewed out because I said Civil War, and he spent a long time explaining that it was the War of Northern Aggression, and that narrative was being pushed for a long time. And to actually maintain these statues with public funds is not representative of your community. That doesn't represent your community. And at this point, if they want to take them down and put them in a museum, so that the fact that some artist did a beautiful sculpture and it's a legitimate part of history, but it's not a legitimate part of our landscape in our cities, in my opinion. Now, I understand, and I understand the argument about history everybody wants to make, but how far back in history do we go, right? Where's the cutoff? Like, so, I mean, the place that you're standing has a lot of history, not just that history, and the reasons why they were erected in the first place were not historically motivated. There was a subtext there, which I think was like, as Charles would say, was not nice. They were not trying to honor history as much as it was intended to remind everybody who the boss is. At the time, a lot of these monuments were put up. So I have no problem with them being removed, and I'm a fan of them being taken down in good faith and as one of the first things we can get to work doing.
Well, Charles, what do you think?
I think it's way past time to remove them, and I would ask anybody to read Mitch Landrieu's incredible speech 3 years ago, the mayor of New Orleans, and he talks about the difference in the remembrance of history and the reverence of history, right, and how to have these monuments that really basically represent 4 years of an aberration of our country's 250-year history, and how difficult it is for a mother to explain to her 8-year-old black daughter why there are statues of Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, and who were those men and what did they mean. That's where we're
and why their tax money continues to pay for the maintenance of it.
Way past that. I mean, our governor.
What about the Heritage United hate gimmick? I mean, like, a lot of people, they hold up the battle flag, which most people call the rebel flag, but it's really the battle flag. So you take these people who take the battle flag and they now say, oh, yeah, but this represents our Southern heritage, even though we know that pretty much after the Civil War, they got rid of that flag, and then the Klan brought it back right before the Civil Rights Movement, during the Civil Rights Movement, rather, as a means, like you said, Edwin, as a means of intimidation. So, but what about those people who are going, yeah, but it is part of our heritage. We can't just throw it away.
Yeah,
so it's in it.
Many of the statues were brought up during the Civil Rights Movement. That's when a lot of those statues appeared.
Right.
When the issues of integration and came up.
So the Confederate battle flag in South Carolina was taken off the State House, and then the initial place they put it was on the ground on the grounds of the State House, which was actually worse in my opinion. But now it resides in a museum, and the history is intact. If you want to see it, it's there, and if the heritage of it is anyone's business to go and pay reverent honor to that, but in the same breath, I have to defend people's rights to fly that flag in front of their home if they choose to. That's their First Amendment right. I can't agree with it. I don't subscribe to it. But if we're going to be members of this society, we have to look to our Constitution, and our Constitution says that you can fly that flag in front of your house if you want to.
I agree.
So I want to move on to another question. Is a lady named Dion S. And basically she had, and I'll paraphrase by saying basically she is wondering what would be the call. And Charles, I'm going to ask you to step into your dad's shoes for a second, if that's at all possible. And what do you think your dad would say about police reform today in regard to best practices, cameras, looking at the recidivism rate, coming back and seeing the disparity in sentencing among the races, which there have been a zillion stories on. What would your dad say about what we could do to kind of make the justice system just, not just for us?
Well, I don't know. I know when we lived in Birmingham, one of the events among many, one of the things my dad said in his speech was there had been 200 and something bombings in Birmingham in the prior decade, and not one of them had been solved. And that black people felt like maybe if there were some blacks on the police force, they would have tried just a little bit harder to solve those crimes. And these were the days when the Freedom Rides came through the South, and John Lewis was on the bus that came into Birmingham. The bus they were pulled off the bus, beaten. The bus was burned. The ones that were left were thrown into jail, and the police never showed up. And the bus station was 2 blocks from the police headquarters. And when they asked Bull Connor why the police weren't there, he said it was Mother's Day and they were home with their mothers. So that's the police that my dad grew up with. So
wow.
As bad as this is, there are some improvements, but yeah, I don't know. It's a tough question. Police, I mean, whatever our experiences have been with police, it is obvious, or should be to everybody, that Black Americans have different experiences than white Americans. Not all.
And that's not to bash the police. Don't get me wrong. Someone breaks into my house, I'm calling the police. I'm not calling Ghostbusters.
That's right. And so, like everything in life, there are good cops and bad cops. And, I heard somebody say, well, if there's 100 cops and 10 of them are bad apples and 90 of them aren't, well, there are 100. It's very, when you watch that horrible thing in Minneapolis, you're wondering how can, an individual can do whatever, but when you've got 3 other people with you, geez, how does that happen? Why doesn't someone step in? And I don't know. I'm not an expert on how to, the defunding. I don't even understand all the defunding stuff that's going on in Minneapolis now. Something's got to be done. That's for sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't had enough time to process the idea of defunding, because I don't understand what the alternative is, and I haven't been able to wrap my head around that. So, this is one of those situations where you have to say I don't know, and it occurs to me in the future. It seems like and this is just a spitball idea, but it might be good if everybody had a turn on the force, if we, like the Israeli army, you turn 17, you're doing a couple of years in the police force, we're going to have some What,
Come
you don't like that idea?
Come on, dude. Me,
No?
when we were 22 years 22 years old in that realm, you and I were together. Could you see either one of us being responsible enough to be on the police? Come on, dude. Look,
I'm not saying they would
Charles
take
didn't even
us.
know me.
I'm not saying they would have taken us. Like, look, like, I'm not saying that I wouldn't have been relegated to the motor pool. That's fine.
I'd have been in the back.
Okay, really? But I don't know. That's what it is.
I don't know about Kelly. They wouldn't have taken Edwin.
No, I agree. They wouldn't. I wouldn't have taken me. I barely take me now.
Well, look at here, man. Charles, I really want to thank you. It's such a pleasure to meet you, man, and such a dad was, but who you are. Edwin speaks very highly of you, and when he came up with this idea of these conversations that Edwin and I have been having, we've been having for 25 years, and we decided that it would be a good idea to kind of pull back the curtain and let people see him, and it really was his mission, and I'm lucky enough that he's put me on it, and collectively we get to show the world people like you. And I just want to thank you so much for helping us spread some awareness and open some eyes and hopefully open some ears too.
Well, I tell you, Edwin called me the other day, Kelly, and I've known Edwin for a long, long time. He's always been a sport. He's a little bit like me. I'm an only child. Edwin's an only son. Edwin's always, he's up. He'll you want to do something, Edwin's up for it. And I've always admired that about him. And he still inspires me today. So,
yeah, he's always down to do something. That's why we end up at the police station. But those are old stories.
We never got caught. Hey, Charles, thank you for being here. This is great. If you haven't seen Charles's father's speech, go to YouTube and type in Charles Morgan speech.
As a matter of fact, what we're going to do is we're going to tag the end of this episode with your dad's speech, if that's okay with you, Charles.
That's perfect.
That way, everybody can. All you got to do is keep watching, and we'd love for you to be able to hear that speech.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
All right, y'all. So we'll see you on the next episode. We want to thank our very good friend here, Mr. Charles Morgan. This is Conversations with Edwin McCain and Kelly Bell. Peace to you.
On Sunday, September 15th, 1963, a bomb ripped through the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. 4 young black girls were killed. Others were maimed and mutilated. Earlier that spring, black children had marched from the church and braved vicious police dogs and fire hoses so the world could see the brutality of segregation. Now, 4 were dead, killed by a bomb planted by Klansmen, bent on holding back the March for Equality. The day after the bombing, a young lawyer, Charles Morgan, spoke at a white businessman's club in Birmingham. It was time to break the silence in the white community, time to speak about who really was to blame for the violence. This is what Morgan said.
Four little girls were killed in Birmingham yesterday. A mad, remorseful, worried community asks, who did it? Who threw that bomb? The answer should be, we all did it. Every last one of us is condemned for that crime and the bombing before it and the ones last month, last year, a decade ago. We all did it. It's every little individual who talks about the niggers and spreads the seeds of his hate to his neighbor and his son. The jokester, the crude oaf whose racial jokes rocked the party with laughter, every governor who ever shouted for lawlessness and became a law violator. courts that move ever so slowly, and newspapers that timorously defend the law. It is all the Christians and all their ministers who spoke too late in anguished cries against violence. We are 10 years of lawless preachments, 10 years of criticism of law, of courts, of our fellow man. A decade of telling school children the opposite of what the civics books say. Yesterday, while Birmingham, which prides itself on the number of its churches, was attending worship services, a bomb went off, and an all-white police force moved into action. A police force which has solved no bombings, a police force which many Negroes feel is perpetuating the very evils we decry. Do not misunderstand me. It is not that I think that white policemen had anything whatsoever to do with the killing of these children or previous bombings. It's just that Negroes who see an all-white police force must think in terms of its failure to prevent or solve the bombings and think perhaps Negroes would have worked a little bit harder. The ministers of Birmingham, who have done so little for Christianity, call for prayer at high noon in a city of lawlessness, and in the same breath speak of our city's image. Did those ministers visit the families of the Negroes in their hour of travail? Do they admit Negroes into their ranks at the church? Who is guilty? A moderate mayor elected to change things in Birmingham and who moves so slowly and looks elsewhere for leadership? A business community which shrugs its shoulders and looks to the police and perhaps somewhere else for leadership? A governor who offers a reward but mentions not his own failure to preserve either segregation or law and order? Those four little Negro girls were human beings. They had lived their 14 years in a leaderless city, a city where no one accepts responsibility, where everyone wants to blame somebody else. A liberal lawyer told me this morning, "Me? I'm not guilty." He then proceeding to discuss the guilt of the other lawyers, the ones who told the people that the Supreme Court did not properly interpret the law. And that's the way it is with Southern liberals. They condemn those with whom they disagree for speaking while they sit in fearful silence. Birmingham, it is a city where four little Negro girls can be born into a second-class school system, live a segregated life, ghettoed into their own little neighborhoods, restricted to Negro churches, destined to ride in Negro ambulances to Negro wards. Local papers on their front and editorial pages call for order and then exclude their names from obituary columns. And who is really guilty? Each of us. Each citizen who has not consciously attempted to bring about peaceful compliance with the decisions of the Supreme Court of the United States, every citizen who votes for the candidate with the bloody flag. Every citizen and every school board member and school teacher and principal and businessman and judge and lawyer who has corrupted the minds of our youth. Every person in this community who has in any way contributed during the past several years to the popularity of hatred is at least as guilty or more so than the demented fool who threw that bomb. Birmingham is not a dying city. It is dead.
Morgan's speech made him a pariah in Birmingham and led to death threats against him and his family. He moved to Atlanta and went on to win numerous landmark civil rights cases. The South, including the city of Birmingham, was transformed in the process.